Cyberpunk 2077's road to launch was one of the longest and most hyped build-ups ever. Off the back of The Witcher 3, their biggest success in sales and critical acclaim by a country mile, CD Projekt Red was riding high into 2020. After several delays, the game's subsequent launch was one of the most disastrous in the history of people launching video games. The bugs were just the start, with performance issues being covered up by reviewers only able to use official footage, braindance epilepsy scares, and a general lack of promised features or interesting innovations. CDPR, like many developers, were no stranger to poorly received launches, but Cyberpunk was on a whole nother level because of the hype-to-reality ratio they were faced with. Understandably, this puts them in a tricky position, albeit one they put themselves in. Do you bail on the single-player portion of a game that was supposed to have multiplayer and still doesn't to move on to your next project? Or salvage what's there at the cost of large amounts of time and money to try and regain some goodwill in the court of public opinion, and maybe a few bucks too? Well, many people would say they made the right decision, and after nearly 3 years of work, CDPR released one of the most significant patches to a game ever. Cyberpunk 2077's 2.0 update is no simple hotfix. It's essentially a free expansion jam-packed with new systems and updates to older ones. And while not a complete overhaul, and without any significant content added to the main game, I'd argue this update, more than the official expansion itself, is what's revived the game and potentially extended its lifespan for years to come. One of the biggest innovations is how the update is monetized, or really, how it isn't. Rather than including the new features from the update in the Phantom Liberty expansion, it was instead released for free before the expansion's launch. Essentially, the 2.0 update is all the systems changes the developers have worked on for the past few years, and the expansion is the additional content. The decision to unlock these big, overarching system changes from behind the paywall of the expansion gave Cyberpunk and CD Projekt a massive free publicity. Allowing players a healthy serving of what the devs have iterated on over the past 3 years has served as a demo for not only Phantom Liberty itself, but what the studio can potentially accomplish in the future. To start off with one of the more obvious changes, Cyberpunk's skill tree was nowhere near the game's biggest issue at launch. Still, there was plenty of room for improvement. Many perks were simply passive bonuses to certain types of damage that never feel like a good reward for a level up. And in general, the UI layout was a bit of a messy web with little clear direction. The 2.0 update provided the perfect opportunity to rework the skill tree because of all the new mechanics that were introduced along with it. As a result, perks feel like a significant boost more often than not because you're picking up something that changes the way you play, like air dashes, a queue for multiple quick hacks on each enemy, or finishers for different weapon types. Almost every one of the added and updated systems gets perks that you can use to influence them too. From stamina to vehicle combat to cyberware, you can find interesting ways to modify many aspects of your 2.0 update experience. And UI wasn't left out either. The new user interface structure of the system helps highlight these cool perks too, since CD Projekt went back to the if it ain't broke don't fix it approach of shaping their skill tree like, well, a tree. When designing systems, it's easy to want to try to make them as unique and complex as humanly possible. Sometimes though, keeping things simple simply leads to better answers. Probably one of the louder complaints of the game's release involved how clothing was implemented. At a base level, clothing acted as a character's armor, so naturally, equipping pieces with better stats was the optimal choice for combat scenarios. But for fashion scenarios, the wide variety of clothing styles in the game and lack of a transmog system frequently made characters look like wacky clown people. Now, I don't personally find how my character looks in a single-player, first-person game to impact my experience too much, but I do understand how looking at them in the menu could break immersion for many players. And the outcry was big enough that special attention was given to clothing in the 2.0 update. The fix completely changed how not only clothing, but also cyberware works. In short, the armor and stats gained from clothing was for the most part moved to cyberware, minus a few considerations for RP, like gas masks and body armor. This makes clothing strictly cosmetic in purpose, and it can be used more flexibly for that purpose because every piece of clothing you dismantle gets added to the wardrobe. So now you can swap around looks freely without worrying about hamstringing your performance in combat. A few changes branching off from this include mod slots being removed from clothing, as well as clothing not dropping from enemies, so players don't feel ripped off by only getting cosmetic loot from a fight. Moving the mechanical functionality of clothing to cyberware was a great choice for a game named Cyberpunk, and comes along with a host of other changes to the system. Cyberware now has a capacity that limits the quantity and quality of the modifications you can make to your body. This capacity can be increased naturally by leveling up or by certain perks in the skill tree. Certain cyberware also gives you stat bonuses based on how much of a certain attribute you have. While mainly a stat switch between the systems, these changes give players more cosmetic flexibility since cyberware handles the vast majority of gameplay functionality and is also invisible for the most part. It also heightens immersion and makes you feel more like a cyberpunk because of how impactful each change to cyberware is on your character. And on top of all this, giving players more meaningful choices because cyberware with stronger effects might not have great armor and vice versa, introducing more interesting trade-offs into how you decide to gear up your character overall. It's a very sleek design that solves many problems, and one I hope the devs consider moving forward with more improvements to the sequel. The original crafting system in Cyberpunk was one that, while functional, ended up being cumbersome and simply not very fun to use. Crafting items took multiple different currencies, and critical parts of crafting, like making higher rarity items, were locked behind the skill tree. This implementation effectively forced players to actively seek out crafting at the sacrifice of other major components of their build, if they wanted to use it even somewhat effectively. And since crafting wasn't presented as a vital part of the gameplay loop, like it is in other games, this led to myself, and I'm sure many other players, writing off the system entirely. In the 2.0 update, some major changes to crafting have made it much more reliably usable. The biggest being that with the perk rework, the crafting skill tree and all related skills no longer exist. Instead, many of those skills were made baseline, so that any character could use them. Combined with the paring down of crafting materials per item, this change makes crafting a much more accessible experience for many more players to tweak their gear. Although that gear is vastly pared down as well. With clothing being purely cosmetic now, cyberware can instead be upgraded using crafting materials, or simply be purchased using currency. For weapons, while many can be crafted, only iconic ones can be upgraded. It feels like CD Projekt knew how frustrating and vestigial crafting felt to most players, and focused these updates on better quality of life features and reducing the complexity to an appropriate amount for a more secondary way to get and upgrade gear when compared to looting. And while crafting still doesn't feel very important to the game overall, these changes smoothed down a lot of the rough edges that had been in the system since launch. One of the most anticipated features at Cyberpunk's release was the police system. Because of how the game was marketed, it was difficult to compare it to another game rather than a mashup of several. One game that featured prominently in that discussion was Grand Theft Auto, and with the advertised police system and multiplayer, many players got excited for some sort of sci-fi GTA Online. And while multiplayer was dropped well before launch, police still remained. And they ended up essentially being the poster child for an unfinished, bug-ridden feature that was emblematic of the rest of the game. Even though Cyberpunk is closer to an action RPG than a GTA game, CD Projekt still felt it was important to take some duct tape to the police system to help enhance the immersion. So important, in fact, that it's the very first section of the patch notes. With the addition of roadblocks appearing when you're wanted, max-tac troops getting called in at high wanted, and the groundbreaking innovation of having them patrol the streets instead of spawning in front of you, police actually feel like a tangible part of the world now. Still, they don't feature any more prominently in the main game than they did before, and there's not much of a reward or fun incentive to blow stuff up in Night City, so this rework still feels relatively out of place. But it's still kinda neat, and I'm not going to complain about free fixes for broken promises. A new mechanic that works in tandem with the police system is the addition of vehicle combat. Previously, shooting from vehicles was restricted to a few moments during missions that were impossible to fail, restricting their impact on the overall game. I'm not sure how many players actually figured this out, but it was pretty lame for me as soon as I realized it. Thankfully, in 2.0, shooting out of your vehicle whenever you want is only the start. Now you can use quick hacks against vehicles, get cars with machine guns attached, grab perks that add new mechanics like sliding out the door, and even swing a katana on a motorcycle, because even though it may not be effective, you'll still look cool doing it. These additions add a lot of cyberpunk flavor to the traditional break the window and pop off a few shots moment in the GTA games. And you'll want to get some use out of them too, because changes to traffic and general enemy AI have made them a lot smarter than their initial showing at launch. They're quicker to react to not only the player's actions, but also other NPCs, whether they're in a vehicle or on foot. Plus, spontaneous interactions like crazy drivers, fights between gangs and police, and aggressive reactions to getting hijacked keep you on your toes while making Night City feel more alive. It's quite the noticeable difference considering how important NPCs are to maintaining immersion and gameplay as a whole. Two of the least flashy updates in 2.0 are actually two of the most important. since you'll be interacting with them no matter what gig you're doing or build you're running. These being the introduction of health and grenade charges, and a few changes to stamina. Now, health hypos and grenades of all types have limited charges. Once a charge is used, it will begin cooling down like a typical video game ability. While this might not seem like a big deal at first, if you play on the hardest difficulties, you'll find out real quick how impactful this seemingly tiny change can be. First, you're motivated to play more tactically, engaging, disengaging, and re-engaging in extended engagements that don't end after the first Sandevistan. Or Sandevistan? Leave a comment down below about how you pronounce this word. No longer can you spam your stack of 300 hypos and have practically infinite health, or toss grenades until all your problems get solved. This makes combat tougher and gives it a more intense vibe when you're down to no charges and have to decide whether to back off or take a risk and finish it. Almost like one of those mods that attempts to make damage more realistic by having both the player and enemies go down in a few shots. Limits on the charges also make combat easier to balance, as designers have a closer idea of the player's capabilities in any one fight, and making things more balanced creates more opportunities for the devs to create tense fights, since they have a better idea of your total power when going into one, and they can adjust enemies more appropriately. A major change to stamina leans into these concepts too. In what might seem like a weird twist, guns now spend stamina when they're fired. This can take a second to get used to, but it ultimately gives ranged combat more of the intensity experienced in melee. And like before with hypos and grenades, you can get buckets of ammo fairly easily if you want to, so putting emphasis on stamina makes it so you can never truly feel safe in difficult fights, no matter how much ammo you have. Plus, with the removal of stamina costs for sprinting, jumping, or sliding outside of combat, the change doesn't feel as taxing as if it was stacked with all of the other already existing stamina drains. And while these are some of the bigger features that were launched with the update, there's still a ton of additional changes under and over the hood. Some of these include enemy scaling, similar to Skyrim or Diablo 4, loot scaling, sleeker phone UI, quicker leveling, the ability to untrack quests, a bunch of minimap enhancements, smoke grenades, cheaper and more accessible ammo, more accurate smart weapons, more silenced weapons, more money from quests, a website where cars can be purchased instead of having everyone try to pawn them off individually through spontaneous phone calls. God, I hated that. Oh yeah, and who could forget trauma drama? That's good stuff. It can't really be overstated how significant the 2.0 update is to Cyberpunk 2077. It's so significant, in fact, that along with what will be the game's only expansion, more players have come back to the game than at any point since its launch back in December of 2020. And thanks to this success, Cyberpunk's developer and publisher has seemingly restored much of their reputation. Although they might not reach post-Witcher 3 hype levels until we know their next release is a solid success, CD Projekt's commitment to 2077 has established the studio as the best in the business for single-player post-launch support. More importantly though, when player population and sales go up, devs and publishers around the industry take notice. While Cyberpunk may be a bit of an exception as one of the most hyped games ever made, the numbers don't lie. 2.0 shows that a significant investment of time and money on a botched launch product can be worthwhile for not only that product, but potentially the success of future ones as well. 1 is an accident, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. And I can see a pattern forming. Will Cyberpunk 2077 2.0 lead to single-player games getting more long-term support? We'll have to wait and see.